As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." That is John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. And I'm your host with Theologic, Sean Mustian, along with
Zach Packey.
And today we again bring on Ryan Chase to have a conversation with us about a subject that is raised in those very verses that we just saw. And before I introduce him further, let me just say that today, as we talk about the work of God in the life of humanity, and even amid some of the harder aspects of suffering and sickness that humanity experiences, this has been something that has been on my mind and heart for a number of months now. Various things in life have brought this about, but one of them being a family that has just recently begun to be a part of our church family, and they have a son that has some significant disabilities. And as I've gotten to know this family, just as a pastor, I've been thinking about how to be a good and skilled pastor, not only in ministering to this family, but also as a church. How do we minister to those among us that are dealing with various forms of disability? And so as we invite Ryan Chase on for this interview, this is where my heart is. And Ryan is going to, here in a moment, explain a little bit why we've brought him on to join us in this conversation and very much to lead the way in this conversation. So he's been with us a few times before. The previous episodes that he's done with us have pertained to education. If you've not heard those before, I would definitely encourage you to go check that out. That was actually his first interview with us. Got the highest number of downloads within the first week of it being published. So we got a lot of good feedback on that. So that in its own right was a very good conversation. But we want to bring him back to speak into another area that he's also personally involved with and has had a personal experience in. And so Ryan, welcome back. Glad to have you with us again. And for those that have not met you through our podcast, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you guys for having me back. It's an honor that you would reach out and invite me, and happy to be with you guys. Yeah, I serve as the lead pastor of Emmaus Road Church in Sioux Falls. My wife, Barbara, and I have been married for 17 years, and we have 5 kids. We have 4 who are living. We have 1 who passed away 10 years ago. Our oldest 2 were identical twins, and they were both born with significant disability as well, a condition called Nemeline myopathy that affected their muscles. So they were both intubated immediately when they were born, have been on ventilators and feeding tubes, not able to move their muscles on their own. And so that has presented all kinds of challenges and experiences that we have navigated over the last 13 years. They were born in 2012, spent the first 4 months of life in the NICU, and then they came home and they require 24/7 nursing care in our home. When they were born, we pressed one of our doctors for a life expectancy guess. We didn't have a diagnosis, didn't have a name for their condition at the time. And their pulmonologist, he didn't want to give us a life expectancy. We just said, based on what you see and what you have experienced in your career, if you had to guess, what would you say? And he said, I would be surprised if they make it to their first birthday. So we did not expect them to live long. When they turned 1, we threw a huge party, invited everybody in our family and our church. And we kind of thought that was going to be it. 1 birthday, and then they turned 2, and then they turned 3. We broke ground on a zero-entry wheelchair accessible home in 2015 because suddenly we're starting to get used to life with these 2 twins. We got wheelchairs for them. We could get out of the house. And then our son Isaac passed away right after we broke ground here. So that was June of 2015. So he was 3 years old, but his twin brother Caleb, he actually turns 13 tomorrow. as we record this here.
Wow.
Um,
Amen.
April 18 is will be his 13th birthday, so he's going to be a teenager, which is an incredible milestone for him. So those are our two oldest sons, and then we have three kids after them, 6, 4, and 2. One daughter, the baby of the family, is our daughter. So that's a little bit about our family.
Good deal. Well, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, just how, yeah, this, it's an honor to do this interview with you as you're just on the day before celebrating your son's first birthday as a teenager. That's good.
Yes.
Good timing. So excited for you guys, and that I hope you guys, I'm sure there's gonna be a party. I hope you guys have a great time in celebrating that.
Yes.
So we definitely see how this is not just something that as a pastor you've encountered in your congregation or some books that you've read or a class that you took in college. This is something that you have walked in and walked in for 13 years. And so
Yeah.
as that's the reason why I wanted you of anybody to talk in, to speak into this. And to begin with, I want to say to our audience that we seek from this interview to be led in how we think about such things in the way that is biblical. There's 101 books out there that could be read from 101 different perspectives, but as men that believe that the Word of God is sufficient for godliness, practice, our doctrine of God, all things, we want to know, how do we think about disability biblically? And Ryan, if you would you talk to us a little bit about the passage that I opened with, John 9, as well as a passage that you've mentioned to me of Exodus 4, and how those have shaped you and your thinking as a father to a son that is ever needing your help?
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you set that up. And maybe I'll just add, before going directly to those passages, kind of the subjective experience as parents. Whenever you get news, for us it was in utero. We went to 20-week ultrasound. That's where we found out that we were expecting twins, which was incredibly exciting. And at that point, they saw that one of the twins had one club foot. And then we had to go in for subsequent ultrasounds, and at each one, they noticed more and more abnormalities, concerns, and just had no idea what the condition was, what was happening, or why, or what the implications of that would be. Looking back, I mean, we just had no idea at the time. But I do know, to anybody listening who is walking through this, that subjective experience, there is a sense of grief and loss. Everything that you dream of as a parent for your kids, the things you envision doing with them, and the life you expect them to have, when that is suddenly changed with some kind of diagnosis, that's disorienting. And my wife and I experienced that as pretty intense grief right away. And in the midst of that, there were certain broad convictions that, looking back, we just are so grateful to God in His kindness that He had prepared our hearts and our minds with certain biblical theological convictions regarding the sovereignty of God, the goodness of God, His wisdom, including God's sovereignty in suffering. And so we had that broadly, but we had to really lean into that and figure out, what does this look like? How does this apply here in this area? So one of the first things I did, I just Googled desiring God and disability, because I knew that was a topic that John Piper had written and spoken on. It turns out it's been a huge focus of ministry from Desiring God. They have an author named John Knight who has a blog called The Works of God, and the title of that blog comes from this passage in John 9. That was a great resource and a help to us in those times, just to renew our minds with the truth of God's word. And so, yeah, John 9 from those early days began to shape our thinking about disability. I think it's significant in that passage when Jesus and his disciples pass a man who was blind from birth. The question that his disciples ask him it's telling. they immediately assume there's sin involved. Um, Somebody sinned, so they want to know who sinned. Was it this man or was it his parents that he was born blind? I think they make a mistake in their reasoning. They go from something true to a conclusion that's not necessarily true. The broad truth is that there is suffering and sickness in the world because of sin. That's true broadly in general. But then they make a particular specific application here. Therefore, if this guy's suffering, he must have sinned, or his parents must have sinned. And the nature of their question is they are asking about the cause. In English, the question why can kind of have two different meanings. One is why did this happen, as in what caused it, and that's what they're asking. What caused his blindness? His parents' sin or his sin? And Jesus flips it around and makes it a question not of the cause but the purpose when he says it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So he's saying God has a redemptive purpose here. God's purpose in this disability is to display the glory of God, to display the works of God in this man's life, which is incredible, especially when you just try to take into consideration um, that man has been blind from his birth. So he lived an entire life of blindness. You think about the challenges of life for him in the ancient world as a blind man, the challenges for his parents, um, all of life lived like that, and God has this glorious redemptive purpose. Um, that tells us something about the character of God, the ultimate purpose of God, as well as I think it just frames for us an understanding of God's goodness and even design in disability. That the glory of God is more satisfying. It's better even than a life of no suffering, no physical complications, perfect health. To see the works of God displayed is even better than that. Um, and God intends to display His goodness in and through physical suffering. I think that passage gives us hope like that.
Hmm.
So yeah, John 9 has been very helpful to us.
And I think you told me that you had the opportunity to preach from John 9 at some point after your son's birth.
Yes, yeah. That sermon would be available on our website if anybody's curious to go listen to it. That was in June of 2019. I called that sermon "Disability by Design," and yeah, I got a chance to preach that text.
Okay. Well, I'll try to look that up.
Yeah,
But I also believe another passage, and if I'm interrupting what you were saying about John 9, please continue. But I did also want to hear you out on Exodus 4 and how what's brought forth out of Exodus 4, the conversation of the Lord through the burning bush to Moses, how that has
yeah,
also had impact on your thinking about disability.
yeah. Fascinating, easy to miss comment or easy to read it and not think about it in this context. But in Exodus 4, when the Lord appears to Moses at the burning bush, and Moses is objecting, he says to God, "Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent either in the past or since you've spoken to your servant, but I'm slow of speech and of tongue." So he's making the case, you can't send me to Pharaoh, send somebody else. And God answers him and he says rhetorically, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord?" So when God makes that claim, he has a particular point to Moses there about his sovereignty over our bodies, our faculties, the tools that we would use in service to God. And God claims that it's the Lord who makes people able to see or not, able to speak or not. And I think there's a temptation sometimes as Christians to feel like our confidence in the sovereignty of God gets tested a little bit in things like this. Like, do we have to try to find a way to get God off the hook for things like disability, somehow distance him from these things? God himself does not need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
He can assert, "I make people, and I make them able to see, or I make them blind, I make them mute or deaf." And then I think that comes with, one of our convictions in the doctrine of God and all of his characteristics and attributes is that what God is, he is all of those things all the time. So we can read this and know that in God's sovereignty over our physical bodies and our faculties and our abilities and our disabilities, he is sovereign, but he is sovereign in a way that's consistent with all of his other attributes. So he is wise and he's good and he's gracious and he's loving. So um, that gives me a lot of confidence then to know
Yeah.
God made my son. He made him the way he is. He has good purposes to display his own works in Caleb's life and in our son Isaac, who passed away. um, yeah, just it engenders our confidence in God. So, a passage like Psalm 139, where David famously says, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. My soul knows that full well. You knit me together in my mother's womb. It'd be easy when it comes to disability for us to think, is that true? Is that true for my sons? Were they fearfully and wonderfully made? Or did God somehow make a mistake when he was knitting them together? Um,
Mm.
we had genetic testing done on our son to see, if this was something that my wife and I were carriers of, or what the cause was, because we didn't know if we could have other children or run the risk of having other children with the same condition. And that genetic testing came back, and we sat down with the genetic counselor, and they said this was a random mutation, as they describe it. De novo is the term for it. Just it was a new random thing, and they can pinpoint this one place in his entire genetic code. There was a T instead of a D, and that change in the letter that caused this condition. We have the confidence as Christians knowing that random mutation is not God slipping up while he was knitting our sons together. That truth holds true for all people as human beings who are the image of God. And so I think that those passages are just a great comfort as a solid foundation, kind of a bedrock for our faith. It still leaves open experientially, day to day, subjectively, all the questions, the challenges, the heartache, and the difficulties, and the exhaustion, and those things. But it does give us a firm foundation to set our feet on, and to find stability in God's sovereignty and in His good purposes.
I think what you're bringing out is such a wonderful help, particularly in our current society today, where we're almost moving toward a utilitarianism that people are only as good as their use.
Oh yeah,
That this idea, but the Christian faith, the message of the Bible, the fact that we are made in God's image, and the fact that you're bringing out, none of that was a mistake. All of that was intentionally done as a design by God. This sort of thing leads to caring for the sick. This leads to proper care for the very image bearers. They're not less human because
right.
they have had some sort of what would not be to us normally normal human health. They are exactly human, and as human as anybody else should be. And that image bearing deserves the respect that no matter what level of intelligence or physical capabilities you have, that same respect ought to be ministered.
Yes, that's excellent. And maybe it's important to clarify. It's not like we say, well, since God is sovereign over this, this is no big deal, or it doesn't
Yeah.
matter, or it's not hard. We have a final promise in Revelation 21:4. There will be a day when God wipes away every tear from our eyes, and there will be no more death, no more mourning or crying or pain anymore. The former things are going to pass away, and that includes illness and
Yeah.
disease and disability. So God is going to remedy those things. And yet our confidence now is these things are not ultimately obstacles to our experience of joy in God, but things that are going to intensify and maximize our joy in God. So Paul can say in 2 Corinthians 4 that these light momentary afflictions are preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond comparison. Nobody going through serious disability with a child is thinking, oh, this feels so light and momentary. I mean, it
Right.
feels heavy and it feels burdensome and it feels impossible. overwhelming, all of those things, and yet in perspective compared to the glory of what will be revealed, not just in spite of this, but really through it. Like the works of God are going to be on display. So for the man in John 9, God displayed his works because the Son of God, the Messiah, came up to him and opened his eyes and healed him and gave him his sight. For my sons, we know this is just how we've thought biblically about healing. God could heal them now if he wanted to, or he will certainly heal them in the resurrection as he's promised to. And when we think about that, it has given us a unique perspective on our bodily resurrection. We're recording this during Holy Week, coming up to Easter, thinking about the resurrection of Christ. And
Mm-hmm.
when we think about our own, say you consider yourself a healthy person with normal abilities, whatever, our glorified bodies, as Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 15, there's going to be such a massive difference from these frail, perishable, mortal bodies we're in now, and then that resurrection body that's going to be raised to life with Christ. And if that's going to be a glorious transformation, Paul compares it to like the seed that's planted in the ground is totally different than the flower that comes up from the ground. We're going to experience that. Think about for somebody who has never walked, never spoken a word, taken a breath on their own without the assistance of a ventilator. Imagine the transformation of that body from
Wow.
this frailty to that glory. So I feel like by faith, I can see already how the works of God are going to be displayed in my son in a
Yeah.
unique way as he's raised from the dead. Or, there are often times that we're eating a meal as a family and our son Caleb is there. He has a feeding pump, so he doesn't eat food the way that we do. It just goes straight into his stomach. And when we're sitting around sharing a meal, the rest of our family, we often just bring that up. My wife will say, Caleb, someday you're going to feast with us. And that's going to be incredible because you're going to taste food and we're going to be celebrating with God in glory with all of his people. And won't that be amazing?
Yeah.
So, those are things that we look forward to, that we can, on the one hand, recognize things aren't the way they ought to be, but God's going to make all things new, and he's going to get glory in that because things were this way now.
And what you've just described is a wonderful example of what it means to continue in and growing in our belief of the gospel. Because
Yeah.
what you're doing is you're believing the gospel promise in all of its various ways that it gets fleshed out. It's not just we say believe in the gospel, that it's unto conversion. But as we are converted and we walk with Christ and we grow with his church, our appreciation of the gospel and all of its good promises develop, and it colors more and more and more of life, so that it brings the joy that is promised, that comes with the gospel, the peace that comes with the gospel. So I love how you just unpack that, because it is just a wonderful example of living in that belief of the gospel truth.
Amen.
And what you describe as well with what you and your family face, and Caleb as well, is the progress of sanctification, becoming like Christ through that trial. I notice, and I witnessed from our previous interviews, the kind spirit that you have, Ryan, and the Christ likeness that would not have happened if that. And I say this for our listeners' sake, it wouldn't have been wrought in you if it wasn't for those things. And so many of us who sort of covet, I want to be like Christ. I want to be like Christ. Maybe I don't like the trial that I would go through. Maybe I don't like the trial that Ryan would be going through, but I value the Christ likeness that's shown in his life, his family's life, and in Caleb's life as a result of that. So we could see that in you.
That's encouraging. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd like to circle back a little bit. I did not want to interrupt what we've just heard. It's too rich to do that. But Ryan, a few minutes ago, you're bringing up the image of God, and I know Zach, as you comment on the, you also brought that in as well. And so we heard a little bit about that. But Ryan, I would like you to take a minute to kind of unpack that idea of what it means for all of humanity to have the image of God. Because a biblical perspective on that is really foundational. Well, not as a whole, but has a part of a foundation to what we're talking about here. And so I would ask you to speak in a little specifically to that and kind of run in that direction for a little bit. Help us to understand what that is and how that informs our understanding of disability and such.
Yeah. Well, the image of God, obviously going back to Genesis 1, the creation of man and woman in the image of God is foundational to our anthropology, our understanding of what human beings are. And it's significant that in Genesis 9:6, it's that fact that God made man in his own image that is brought to bear on the prohibition of murder. The reason murder is wrong is because humans are the image of God.
Hmm.
So that tells us something about how we ought to treat one another. So there are moral and ethical implications of the fact that we are the image of God. And I think it's easy to um, for there to be confusion about what the image of God is, what it means. Oftentimes we ask that question, what exactly is it about us that reflects God or is like God? And sometimes it's described in a way where it's found in a specific set of functions or features that we possess. So maybe it's our intellect or our moral reasoning or our ability to have relationships and communicate or physical ability to take dominion over the world in Genesis 1 or whatever. The problem is if the image of God is found in certain attributes that we have or functions that we perform, abilities that we have, then it would be possible that some people have more of it than others. Some people have a higher IQ than others. Some people are physically stronger, more fit than others. Um, and I would contend that the image of God is not so much something that we do, but it's what we are. It's just connected to being human. God made human beings to be his image on earth, to represent him, to rule the world under him. We know that that's distorted because of sin, but a significant theme throughout the New Testament is how Christ Jesus is the new Adam who perfectly trusts and obeys God, and then makes it possible for fallen humans to be restored, to be conformed to His image, and to be the image of God on earth, part of this new humanity that's reconstituted in Christ. So, defining the image of God as what we are as human beings is important when it comes to disability and the sanctity of human life. Otherwise, and there are people in the world today who would make arguments like this. If your value as a human being depends on certain functions like your rationality or your ability to make decisions or act in the world, well, then in utero, babies before they're born lack some of those characteristics. Somebody with significant disabilities might not be able to do certain things. Do they have value? Do they have rights as a human being? Do they deserve to be protected? And we would argue as Christians that really the more vulnerable somebody is, the more in need of protection they are,
Hmm.
the more necessary it is to protect them and and treat them with care rather than seeing them as more expendable. The more vulnerable they are, the more expendable they are. We would view it the opposite way. If you are a human being, you are the image of God, and it doesn't depend on what you can or can't do. It's just part of the essence of nature that we were created in the image of God.
That's
That's kind of an overview.
That's a really good distinction you're making. I really appreciate that because when people talk about intellect, emotion, and will, it's important to clarify that they should not mean that is the image of God, but that at best evidences the image of God in man. It's a
Yeah,
sign that a person. That's not what it is, but the evidence of it. That's really good. I'm glad you say that. That helps me out a lot.
yeah. I would just add. I think it's helpful to think of those as tools that God has given us
Yeah.
to carry out the purpose for which He made us.
Yeah.
So those are certainly important things, but we do see a variety in just between humans in our ability.
Yeah.
Animals possess to some degree the ability to communicate or certain levels of intelligence. It's not just that we are, possess those in slightly greater quantity than animals do, and if you cross that threshold, then now you're the image of God versus just an animal or
Right.
an expendable human being. We just, as humans, if you are a human, you are the image of God. And then God has given us tools in varying degrees with which we can represent God and live for the glory of God in life. And I would just say there, every human being has been given by God certain tools and the ability still to glorify God. So that looks different for my son Caleb than it does for somebody who is healthy and able. But we can still teach him, when we ask that catechism question, why did God create you? Uh,
Hmm.
God created me to live for his glory. That's still the purpose of his life. That is
Hmm.
not impaired by his physical disabilities.
Yeah.
Amen. So, Ryan, as we talk about the image of God, and we talk about that in connection with disability, we're having this conversation in a context, a cultural context that can be quite picky about words and terminology, everything from various kinds of racism to other quote unquote insensitivities. So
Mhm.
this brings me to want to talk with you about like the terms that we use as we talk about people that we commonly call disabled. And there's definitely movements to try to come up with different terms that may be more friendly or maybe more technical. There could be a whole many different reasons why certain changes to that might happen. But does the Bible does the Bible guide us as to not only how
Mm.
we think about this, but how we talk about it?
Yeah, that's helpful. I would probably just start with the command in Ephesians 4 really guides all of our communication as Christians when we are told to speak the truth in love to one another. The two significant things there are truth in love. So we want our language to be truthful, accurate, honest, and we want to speak that out of a motivation of love for people, love for God. So my concern sometimes with some of the modern, like politically correct search for what I would call euphemisms.
Mm.
A euphemism is kind of a new term to describe something. It's still trying to talk about the same thing, but it just says it in a way that's supposed to somehow be
Softer.
softer, less offensive, whatever, but it's still talking about the same thing. And oftentimes, euphemisms, while they might be well intentioned, they don't necessarily help because if they're not giving us clear language, if we're not clear on the definition, um, then it's not really helpful. So I do think the Bible gives us permission to speak honestly as we describe um, abilities, physical abilities. So we talked about Exodus 4, and God himself uses that language there. Who makes man mute or deaf or seeing or blind? To describe somebody who can't speak as mute is not necessarily unloving. It's true, and it can be done in love. Now, obviously, anything could be used in an unkind way.
Yeah.
Anything could be used to speak disparagingly of a person who has a certain physical, cognitive challenge, limitation, disability. Or the other thing that is common is that a term for somebody with a disability is then used as a slur for somebody who doesn't have that. And then that just becomes, take the word retarded. Somebody using that word, which just means, slower to describe somebody else, that can easily be used in an unkind, unloving way. So I think that's really the goal, to speak the truth in love. Leviticus 21 has a bunch of laws as God's describing to Moses, the priests, the Levites who are serving in the temple. There's a whole list there of Levites. It says if people in this Levitical family have any of these physical conditions, they can't serve in the tabernacle, and they're listed out. They're described in detail. It's not that they're not human, but they have different abilities, and God um, is not unwise or unkind when He sets the bar at a certain place for a certain function. Um, and yet makes provision for those people through their food and their shelter later on in that chapter. So I just think the Bible gives us permission to talk honestly, but it should always be done in love. And I would just point anybody to like the command in Leviticus 19:14. This is long before the ADA. You go back several decades in America, and we had a culture that was not very mindful of
Mm.
people with disabilities. So even things like handicap parking spots, that's a fairly recent development. Um, ADA accessible facilities, that's fairly recent, but long before that, Leviticus 19:14, God gives his people this command: you shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. That's incredible. It indicates that in sin, people are inclined to take advantage of, or even uh, mock or mistreat those with disabilities for their own pleasure. Why would you speak a curse to a deaf person? Well, because they can't hear you. So the joke's on him. He doesn't know what I'm saying. Why would you put a stumbling block in front of a blind person? Because he can't see it. So it gives this impression of people who are treating somebody with a disability unkindly just for sport, just because they can. And there's this sobering command: you shall not do that. You shall fear your God. People who act like that don't fear God. And so, God's people have always been commanded to be mindful of those with different abilities, and then to treat them in ways that are appropriate.
So would it look, to take that verse you just quoted, it's in the negative. So
Yep.
to fear God looks like blessing the deaf, and instead of putting a stumbling block before the blind, to assist them. Would that be a fair understanding of the spirit of that command, that it's not just God saying, don't do these things, but in fear, there should be a positive going forward of action?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an encouragement. The positive action of, if all of God's laws really are just summed up in love your neighbor, that one's encouraging us to think about, well, how do I love my neighbor, my family member, another person in my church with physical limitations? Are there things we could do to assist them, to give them access so they can participate with us? And that can be challenging. There might be costs associated with that. But we should be mindful and motivated to care for others.
So what are some ways that your church family has shown that kind of love to you and Barbara and your son? Like, what does it look like? And I asked this to know, but also trying to spur people on to think about, maybe there's people listening that have somebody in their church family that has some kind of disability into which they could help, they could speak into. So what does it look like for you guys to receive that from your church family? And what kind of examples can we put forward for people to consider as to how to be a church to persons among them that have these kind of disabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the challenges in speaking into that is just how broad this topic is. The wide variety of disabilities and what those particular challenges are. So in each case, you kind of have to drop down into that particular case and really just get to know, if there's say a family in your church, you have to get to know them. Probably takes a lot of interest, care, curiosity to ask questions. I think sometimes I've just noticed over the years, people are afraid to ask us questions, or they don't want to be offensive. And so we are often just reassuring people, hey, it's not awkward or offensive to us if you show care and interest. If you are curious and you want to ask questions about what life is like for Caleb or for us, we welcome that. We appreciate that. What can be awkward is if somebody just stares at Caleb from a distance, but it's totally different if somebody walks up and just treats him like a human and asks him or asks us about him. So I would just say broadly, that's the place to start. In our particular case, Caleb he's in a wheelchair. That limits our access to certain places and activities and events. And we've just been blessed with a church family that has been mindful of that and eager to make accommodations. I think one of the most significant ones for us was a family in our small group who went out on their own without telling us. They bought a ramp for their house so that when we went over there, so that they could invite us over, so we could roll him up his ramp to get into their front door. We got there and we were like, "Are you kidding? You bought that ramp?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, it's nothing. We'll just fold it up and keep it in the garage, and then you can come in when you're here." That just kind of blew us away. So I think accommodations like that, we've had people who, it might be difficult for them to host us in their home. So they've said, what if we prepare the meal and we just bring it to your house? Could we come over? But we'll do that work. We want to have you over for dinner, but we know Caleb can't get in here. So people like that who take initiative to show hospitality, but get creative about what that looks like, that has really blessed our family. Um, but I think that a huge area, probably a lot of families experience, is just the need for respite care. Um, if there are people in the church who would take the time to learn how to care for a child, their particular needs, if you can serve a family that way and give the mom and dad a break, even for a couple hours, that would be a huge blessing. We've just found, the number of people who know Caleb and can take care of him is pretty limited. So anybody who invest that time to get to know him, to be able to take care of him, is a huge blessing. So probably lots of other practical ideas. And I would just add, sometimes people ask us, well, what can we do, or how can we serve you? And that can be a really difficult question to know how to answer.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I don't have a specific that comes to mind, but I just know over the years, the kind of care that has been most incredible to us, people who just have taken an interest and observed us, and they just have come up with an idea on their own, like, hey, what if we did this for you? We want to do this, and that communicates so much love, even if it doesn't work out, or even if we say, yeah, that's so thoughtful, but that won't work. It means a ton to us. So those are a few thoughts.
Okay.
Sweet.
That even as you're saying that, I'm thinking back to an episode that Zach and I just recorded recently on caring for widows according to 1 Timothy 6, and just thinking about that. Not to take away this conversation, but just there's so many implications to what you just said. Even thinking about the elderly, we may not always use the terminology of disabled, but they begin to get into years of life where age has taken its toll, and a lot of what you just said really speaks into those areas of persons that have never been diagnosed as quote unquote disabled, but just as the years are going by, they're beginning to experience weakness, fatigue, etc. Yeah. And the principles you just set before us. I want to highlight that for our audience to think about. Okay, this episode has been on disability, and it's something that I do think needs to be spoken about from a biblical worldview. But I also hope that you'll go back and listen through this again for principles about, okay, what does this look like in general? Because maybe you don't have anybody in your church or immediately in your life that relates directly to the topic of disability. But I can guarantee you that there's principles that Ryan has laid out that would apply to the elderly person that you know, or somebody that is maybe really sick, has a disease, but isn't necessarily categorized as disabled, or someone that is going through a significant season of heavy suffering. And so what we're talking about here, yes, it hones in on a particular aspect of God's creation, of a portion of humanity. But let's think broadly in light of what we've heard here as to how we can be followers of Christ, the hands and feet of Christ, and namely as the body of Christ to those in our midst.
Yeah, this speaks to the lady who is just diagnosed with cancer or is bedridden because of some accident. I mean, all these things, disabilities aren't just things you're born with. Disabilities are things that can develop throughout life. So this really does apply. If you're in a church that has people in it, you're going to likely come across certain levels of disability depending on where somebody's at in life or what's going to happen to them in the future. So keep these things in mind.
And I would just add to that, I think 1 Corinthians 12, again, is so informative when Paul's talking about using the metaphor of the body and different parts that make up the body. And he says the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty. And then he says, but God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body. So even just that, knowing, like you guys are saying, whatever church you're in, God has so composed every church so that it's made up of one body, many parts. And those parts, some are going to be stronger, some are going to be weaker. And that's by God's design, on purpose. He has so composed the body in that way for our good, for his glory. And so when you have eyes to see it, it's important to be mindful of.
Yeah, if he's done that, he's done this to his delight.
Yes.
Because it pleases him. And if it pleases him, dear Christian, let's rejoice in that reality. He has set up the world. He set up his church exactly the way he wants it to be, and let's minister in light of it. Let's Let's praise him for it and learn to value those people, the stronger and the weaker, exactly the way that he does, because he has committed himself to such kindness to them through the cross.
As we begin to wrap up, I want to recommend a book. I'm going to ask Ryan here in a moment to make some recommendations on resources, podcasts, books, etc. But a book that has been helping me kind of me navigate this season as I'm pastoring a family that has a son with disabilities. I've been reading this book entitled Parenting and Disabilities, Abiding in God's Presence. It's by Stephanie. I think her last name is pronounced Hubach. It's Hubach. But even as a man that doesn't deal personally with disabilities, nor do I have children that do, this devotional, it's a 31-day devotional, has been not only helpful in me thinking about this young man at my church that has disability, but also just so many implications of the gospel to life. I would encourage anybody listening to this, go check it out. Again, it's a 31-day devotional. There's a few pages a day. I would encourage you to check that out. And then Ryan, I would ask you, I know you mentioned John Knight earlier. If you want to speak more to that, please. If there's other resources, but also along with resources, as we close, what would be some final thoughts to parents that might be listening, family members that might be listening, that are regular caregivers to someone with disability?
Yeah. Well, I think as far as resources go, I would just encourage, John Knight, The Works of God, really Design God. They just have a ton of resources on disability. They've put on some conferences on it. So there are tons of great resources, audio that's available out there, dealing with disability and the sovereign goodness of God. Andrew Wilson's book, The Life We Never Expected, somebody told us about that early on. That was a great help to us. Broadly, just on the topic of the sovereignty and goodness of God and suffering, is the book When God Weeps by Johnny Erickson Tata and Stephen Estes. That has been a great help to me and to many others over the years. I would recommend that. As far as encouragement to those who are caring for family members with disabilities, I would encourage you, give attention to your own soul. One of the things that we're often most mindful of is just the amount of work and the challenge, the difficulty, the labor that's involved in caring for a son with special needs. And it's easy in the midst of all of that busyness to be overwhelmed and exhausted and to not give attention to the life of our soul, what we're thinking and what we're feeling, to be mindful of attitudes of unbelief that can start to grow in our own hearts, and hard and bitter thoughts toward God and those things. And so I think prioritizing that, because we're so aware of a physical condition and physical needs, we need to give priority to our spiritual well-being, that we are renewing our mind with truth, trusting the promises of God, clinging to God in faith in the midst of that, processing grief and questions in a godly way, like the laments in the Psalms help us to do. It's okay to ask questions like, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" But we have to be expressing those questions, that pain, that grief, in a Godward way, so that it doesn't turn kind of into a toxic bitterness in our own souls. I would encourage parents, prioritize your marriage.
Yes.
It's easy for people to neglect their marriage because suddenly the biggest need they're aware of is this child. And then if the marriage starts to suffer, though, then everything falls apart.
Yeah.
And so prioritize your marriage, find time you can carve out to invest in, communicate with each other, stay on the same page, learn how to deal with conflict in godly ways, to confess your sin and forgive each other, be quick to restore fellowship when you're out of fellowship with each other. That just is absolutely essential to prioritize your marriage. So when our son Isaac died, one of the first things Barbara and I said to each other, we were just aware there's a statistic that parents who lose a child, there's a much higher rate of divorce, which is a fascinating phenomenon in itself. But the point is, we're just aware immediately we have to lean into each other as we grieve, as we process. We can't let this, even just starting slowly, gradually, to drift apart. So prioritize your marriage. And I would say stay connected to your church. It might be difficult. There might be many times when you don't feel like participating in your local church. But you need the body, and like we were just saying, the body needs you. God has constituted the body this way. And so those people in your church community are meant by God to be a real tangible source of strength, a means of grace in your life. And being in fellowship with them, being under the preaching of the word, participating in that worship gathering of believers is important. And if there's a disability that really makes that an obstacle, I think that's a great question to have with your pastors. How can we participate here? What accommodations could possibly be made? So those are I think key priorities.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, thank you for that. And Ryan, once again, thank you for joining us here at Theologic. This has once again been a very thorough, robust, and joyful conversation. So
Yes,
thank you.
Yeah.
May God
Thank you,
bless
guys.
it. So to those listening, may this be a blessing to you.